Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. This is Joyce Perhack. I'm president of Pro Show Incorporated and the sponsor of Christmas Expo. Christmas Expo is an annual event, always held the third weekend in July. If you haven't attended in the past, you'll want to mark July 13th through the 15th, 2023 on your calendar and plan to join us in Lexington, Kentucky as we celebrate 20 years of Christmas Expo and 10 years of Pro Show's ownership. We're going to have a great time and we hope to see you there. I encourage you to join our Christmas Expo community Facebook page, where you'll see important announcements and updates, receive information on future webinars, and take part in discussions that will help with your display. It's a great way to interact with this terrific community. Our speaker this evening is Shane Rem. Shane has 30+ years of experience with IT and computers and is now a 5th-year light show enthusiast. If you have a question, please put it in the Q&A and our moderators, Catherine and Ann, will handle it from there and get it in front of Shane for an answer. And now it's my pleasure to introduce to you Shane. Enjoy the webinar.
Thank you, Joyce. And thank you everyone for attending. I'll just start by saying I know networking is one of those subjects that can be super complicated and intimidating for a lot of people, especially those without technological backgrounds. So I kind of wanted to approach this from a ground up 101 stance. It doesn't have to be that complicated. It can be really simple to set up a light show network. So we're going to kind of explore that tonight. So a little bit about me, as Joyce mentioned, I've been tinkering with computers for about 30 years off and on. I've done some work as a mechanic in the Air Force. I did some combat comm in the reserves. I did field service for Hewlett Packard. I was the guy that came out to fix your printers and the laptops at your office. Currently, I work for Northrop Grumman, and I've been doing light shows for 5 years now and playing with LEDs a lot longer than that. But so you may notice my show looks a little different than most. That's because I enjoy kind of pushing the limits and trying different things, new things, and seeing what works and what doesn't. So I'm always up for exploring new things. So again, I want to say that this class is not for networking experts. If you have a layer 3 switch in your house or multiple VLANs, this is not for you. This is for those that can barely get their own computers up and running. This is an introductory class. So we're just going to cover the basics here tonight. So with that started, what I want to do here is, instead of throwing a bunch of new terms at you right off the bat, we're going to kind of just learn them as we go. We're going to start by building the simplest network we can and go from there. And we'll introduce the new concepts and ideas as we build up to a full-on light show network. So I'm going to start by covering some of the basics on cabling. Network cabling, there's a lot of different flavors out there in network cables. You can buy them pre-made or you can make them yourself. You can buy them on a spool of different lengths. One of the key things we want to take away from this is what Cat 5e and Cat 6 are. You may have heard those terms. So Cat 5e is the cheapest cable that we can get that will support gigabit networks. And that's what we want. Cat 5e is still out there. It's pretty much obsolete, but it'll only support 100 megabit speeds. So Cat 5e or Cat 6 is the way to go. One of the key differences here is the Cat 6 has a little divider inside it that separates the wire pairs. So it makes it a little bit more robust, but it's also a little bit thicker and it can be a little more difficult to work with. There are Cat 5, Cat 6e, Cat 7, Cat 8, and even fiber optics, and those are used in corporate networks and data centers, and they're way overkill for anything that we're going to be doing in a light show. So we don't want to use those, and they can be very difficult to work with. One of my biggest regrets on my show is when I first started, I bought 1,000 foot spool of Cat 6A cable because I thought it was a good deal, and I hate it. It's a pain to work with, and I totally regret it every time I have to make a cable. A couple other things we want to look for is UV rated or outdoor rated cables, which most of our cables will be outdoors. So we want to go for that if we can. You may also hear of plenum or riser cables. Those are made for inside commercial structures, so we don't need to worry about those. Pure copper is something we want to look for. Sorry, in a light cable. Copper clad aluminum is the other thing, and we don't want that. That's when the wires are made of aluminum, just coated with copper instead of made from pure copper. Also, there's things like UTP or STP, that's shielded twisted pair or unshielded twisted pair. Either will work. The shielded is going to be a little more expensive, and it's one more thing you have to deal with. So I'd say go for UTP. That's plenty. But any of these will work for a light show. If you got your IT office is getting rid of a bunch of cable, by all means, grab it and use it. Any of these will work, but this is kind of what we want to look for in a cable. So terminating cables, if this is something you've never done, I would encourage you to try it. It looks kind of intimidating, but once you get the hang of it, you can do it pretty quick. I'm not going to go through the process here. There's plenty of tutorials on YouTube that will show you how to do it. I just want to cover a few key things. The name of the connector here is called an RJ45. That's registered jack 45. And that's the specification that describes the connector. Pass through. This is somewhat new in the industry, maybe in the last 5 to 10 years. And this is where you can pull the wires directly through the connector. The older ones, you'd have to trim these, and they have to be perfectly even, and you cram them in there as far as you can and hope that you get it in there deep enough. With the pass-throughs, you just run them through and pull the connector tight, and you're good. So this can save a lot of time. A lot of these older network guys take pride on how fast they can terminate a cable. So they may scoff at these, but this is what we want. 568B. So this is another specification that describes what order the wires go in. They go in a specific order. And again, this is something you can Google, just network connection pinout or something like that, and you'll find plenty of graphics that describe how this is set up. And you can print it out, keep it at your workstation for a handy reference. Service loop, I'll cover real quick. If you're just going to make your own cables and pull them from switch to the controller, pull a few extra feet, because it only costs about 10 cents a foot. And then if you decide you want to move it later on, you don't have to make a new cable. And it also gives you some leeway. If you screw up one of the connectors, you can just cut it off and put another one on. It'll save you a lot of trouble down the road. So always pull a few extra feet. Crimping tools. There's specific crimping tools for the pass-through connectors that have this little razor on the opposite side here. And what that does is it trims the excess wires off as it crimps down on the terminals. So the older ones don't have that razor, so they won't work. So if you're going to use the pass-throughs, make sure you get pass-through compatible crimping tools. Finally, I can't emphasize enough a cable tester. Again, these are super cheap. You don't need a fluke meter or anything like that. This is going to cost you hundreds of dollars. These are about 15 bucks on Amazon. And it can be simpler to use. You plug one end to the base and one end into the receiver, flip it to on, and the lights just go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If it skips one of the lights, then you got a bad cable. That's all there is to it. Super easy, and it'll save you tons of headaches troubleshooting. So again, if you've never made a cable before, watch one of those tutorials on YouTube and give it a try. It's not that hard, and it'll save you a lot of headache and a lot of money setting up a network. All right, so now that we got our cables out of the way, we're going to take our first network here, our first very simple, very easy network, which consists of 2 PCs connected directly to each other. This is the simplest network that we can come up with. Each computer is going to have what's called an IP address, Internet Protocol address. And you've all probably seen numbers that look like this before. So each of these 4 digits is called an octet. And it's called that because it's made up of 8 bits of binary data. Each of these digits right here can be a 1 or a 0, and each position has a value: 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, 128. You flip one of these off and on, and that gives you your numerical value, which means that each one of these can have the highest possible value would be 255. So it could be anywhere from 0 to 255 for each one of these. So now out of those 4 octets, that's broken down into 2 parts called a network ID and a host ID. So the network number is indicated by what's called a subnet mask. So this tells us, so these values are 255, 255 for class C networks. And this is what most of us have in our house. There are class A networks and class B networks, and those are normally reserved for big corporate entities. We don't need to worry about those. So we're concerned with class C networks. They're almost all going to be 255, 255, 255 subnet mask, which indicates the first 3 octets are your network ID, which in most cases, most of our home networks, that's going to be 192.168.1, or sometimes a .0 there. And that's our network. And then our host ID is the 4th digit right here. So I'll assign .10 to this guy, .15 to this guy. And that should get these 2 talking. So a good way to tell if they're talking, we get into a troubleshooting here, is called a ping. And this is a very simple tool that's built into almost every network device. So I'm going to start with the IP config command here that's built into Windows. This is a command that tells us information about our current network connection. So this is my PC here, and it shows us our IP address here is 192.168.1.32. Our subnet mask is 255, 255, 255.0. So this is our network address, and our host ID here is .32. So to tell if it's talking to anything else, we can do what's called a ping, which sends a small packet of data to another computer and tells us if they're communicating or not. So in this case, I want to try 192.168.0.1, and I'm not getting anything back because I typed the wrong network address. So it can't find this computer. So we're going to type another one that we can talk to, just .1. And I'm getting a reply from that one. So these 2 PCs, .1 and .32, I just verified they're connected. And ping couldn't be simpler to use. And this is used on big, huge corporate enterprise networks, cross-country pings, around the world pings. It's a standard tool. It's been there forever. So it's a good one to get familiar with. And again, there's IP config, gives us information about our current connection. These are just some other virtual connectors we're not worried about, but there's also, you can do IP config /all, and that'll give you even more information. This will tell you your physical address, your manufacturer, leases, DHCPs, and we'll talk about some of this stuff later, but that's how we access a lot of this data. So with our simple network here, so we got these 2 talking back and forth, but it gets kind of boring. So we want to add a 3rd PC. And this is where we introduce our switch. And this is one of the core pieces of our network here. This is where the magic happens. So it's not quite a splitter. The way this works is you plug it in, to your PC. The switch records the address of the PC and every other address PC, the address of every other PC connected to it, puts it in a table, and it switches data from one to another. So if I'm talking to 15, talking to 10, it switches the data back and forth between these two. And then it can switch to 20 if I'm talking to 20, or back and forth, or wherever it wants to go. The key difference here is it creates a virtual link between the two. So it's not just blasting data out everywhere. There's older devices called hubs that did exactly that. They'd repeat the data on all the ports and send it out all over the place. And it would just create a flood of data on your network. So if you happen to come across one of those, do us all a favor and throw it in the trash. This is a very basic switch. These are the kind you find on Amazon or Best Buy. They're about 30, 40 bucks, I think. I've seen them on sale sometimes as cheap as 15 bucks. They're rock solid. They have they're plug and play. There's no configuration, no buttons. You just plug it in and go. Couldn't be easier. I'll also mention different speeds. So megabits per second is the standard measurement for network speeds. Some of the standards are 10 megabits, 100 megabits, and 1000 megabits or gigabit networks. And this is kind of the norm now, is the gigabit. There's a few older devices, some of the Raspberry Pis and some of the BeagleBones, I think, some of the controllers that come from Falcon or the other manufacturers, I think, are limited to 100 megabits per second. But the way to tell, I think Windows will pop up and tell you what speed it is if you want. But you can also look at the lights, the LEDs on each of these ports, and this will give you the status. I think they're kind of standardized across the different brands of switches, but they should tell you what's going on. It'll tell you if it's a 10, a 100, a gigabit, if it's blinking or not. That'll tell you what's going on with your network. So again, this is another troubleshooting device you want to keep an eye on. Also touch real quick on, I've seen some people mention managed switches in their networks. And what that is the switch will have a web interface. It'll have its own IP and its own brain, and you can manually manipulate each of these ports. You can turn them off and on or assign different details or protocols to different ports. And that's way overkill for what we're doing. Again, those are reserved for kind of the big enterprise or even medium-sized businesses to segregate different parts of their network. And that's not something we need to be concerned with for us. So go with the unmanaged switches that you get from Amazon or Best Buy or any of those other places. Okay, so now coming back from that, again, this is kind of all we really need to run a show. You can plug a controller, a Pi, or anything into here and get it going. But if you get to the point where you want to download the latest X-Lights or controller hardware, update your hardware right before your show, you need a connection to the internet. And that's where the router comes in. So the router connects directly to your switch again, and all it really does is route data to the internet that's not local. This is, we've all seen some of these at our houses. We have one that's probably set up by your ISP, Cox or Spectrum or Frontier, whoever they're going to be similar to this right here. And this is actually a 3-in-1 device. So this right here is a switch. This is just a dumb switch. It's connected to a router right here that connects directly to the internet. And it also acts as a modem. It translates, it connects to the that network that's running through your neighborhood is a lot different than the one that's running through your house. So it translates data so we can use it in our house. So one term we need to talk about here is the default gateway. So if 10 and 15 are talking back and forth to each other, and then on 10, I decided I want to reach out to xlights.org or google.com, the switch isn't going to know what to do with it. It doesn't know what that is. So it's going to send it to the default gateway, which is our router. And the router is going to work its magic and send it off to the internet. So that's the default gateway. Also wanted to touch real quick on DNS here. That's domain name service. That's a service that actually runs on your router, and it translates the host names, the English host names like google.com, translates that to an IP address. Believe it or not, google.com does have an IP address, just like any other PC on the internet. But google.com is a lot easier to remember. So DNS translates that for us. So we don't have to remember the number of every website we go to. I think that's all we need to cover there. So now we can start setting up our show network here. So again, this kind of we got it kind of segregated here, and this is one of the things I wanted to make as clear as I could is our show network over here is isolated from the other PC by this switch. So these are two separate things in their own little areas. This is say .15 is our sequencing PC that we got inside on our desk, and everything else is outside running the show. So they're not directly connected. And that's because these are our show players, either a Raspberry Pi running FPP or a PC running Xschedule. As these are playing the shows, it's sending data out to all the controllers all at once. There's a lot of data going back and forth here, and we don't want that coming back into our house. So the way this says set up right here, we could actually disconnect this link here and the show would still play on. So I also want to talk about real quick static IPs versus dynamic. So static IPs are what we've done so far. We've assigned our own IP address to these PCs. Now, a lot of the new, if you got a new instance of FPP or a brand new controller that you just hook up to your network, it doesn't have an address signed to it. So what it does is it's going to talk to the router. It's going to send out a broadcast message saying, hey, here I am. It'll talk to the router. The router will say, who are you? It'll say, I don't know. I don't have an address. Router says, okay, here's your address. And it'll pick a random number and assign that IP address to this device. So that's how it gets its IP address. That's what'll show up on the display here. And there's a service called DHCP. It's Dynamic Host Control Protocol that does that. This is something we see every day too on our routers when we, like when you log into Wi-Fi on your phone or your iPad or tablet or smart TV or something like that. All those devices have IP addresses, but you don't see them. You just connect to the Wi-Fi and you go. But this is happening in the background. The router's assigning those devices an IP address. Another thing to know about that is there are leases, what they call leases on IP addresses. And I will show you here. ipconfig/all. And right here, it's going to show us this is my lease. I got my PC here is set up on DHCP, and I got a lease from now till about this time tomorrow, so about a 24-hour lease. That means whatever IP address I have right now, which is .32, that's going to go away because we're only limited to 255 possible addresses, because that's our host ID. So it'll assign a temporary IP, and it'll renew almost right away. Next time I get on the network, it'll just reconnect, renew, grab a new address. It's usually, it will grab the same one, but not always. So your IP address can change if you're running DHCP. That's why it's important when we are using are addressing our controllers and our FTP instances, we want to use static IPs. We type those in manually and they do not change. So the other thing we need to talk about is when we start assigning static IPs is keeping track of them all. So there's a lot of addresses. Our routers are they all have different interfaces, but they almost all have an option to limit the scope of your DHCP. So like my personal network, I have the scope limited to .50. And then I use a spreadsheet here, a Google spreadsheet, to keep track of all my IP addresses of all the equipment on my network. So we can see right here, I have some cameras. These are all static IPs, some of my home stuff, all static IPs, FTP instances, all static IPs. I keep track of them here. Every time I assign a new static IP to a device, I add it to this spreadsheet. That's how I keep track of them. Because if you get the somehow accidentally assign the same IP address to two devices, it's going to cause a conflict on your network, and it won't work. That is a showstopper for a lot of cases. Another thing I wanted to show off real quick is a lot of the devices, like a Raspberry Pi, it doesn't have a display. So if you put a new instance of FTP on your network, FTP is going to grab an IP address, but you won't know what it is. So how do we do that? One way is you can connect speakers to it and it'll announce its IP when it boots up. But the much easier way is to use an IP scanner. There's several apps that do this for different phones. You can download that'll scan your network. But if you have X-Lights installed on your PC, then you already have this installed as well. And that went away. Okay, there it is. So what this does is this will scan. So we'll go out and send a ping command to every possible address on your network, and it'll keep track of which ones reply. So there's a reply there, there's a reply there. A couple devices are replying, and then it's going to go through and it'll query them a little more, and it's going to fill in some of this information for us. So here we go. Okay, so yeah, .1 is my router. There's Mac ID, made by Netgear. A few other devices. Again, these are all my anything below 50 is the DHCP address. So a lot of these are Google devices or Amazon devices or phones, or things that we don't really need to keep track of that much. They just kind of hook them up and work. As we get to above 50, we got cameras, FTP instances, Tasmota, home automation stuff. This is all these are all static IPs. As you can see, they'll identify our FPP instances. Tell us exactly what hardware we're running. It gives all kinds of information about these. So yeah, get familiar with a network scanner. It sounds intimidating, but it's really not. It just kind of pings everything on your network and builds you a list of what you have. Simple as that. One last thing I want to touch on here is MAC addresses. MAC address is a physical address that's burned into every device that connects to a network. Every NIC, has its own physical address, and it looks kind of like this. If I remember correctly, the first 3 digits or groups of digits there identify the manufacturer, and then the last 3 are like a serial number. And this is what this is the address that the switch is used to identify who's who. You probably don't see these very often, and they're supposed to be unique to every device in the world. And I think that's all we need to cover here. All right, so finally, a few last things I wanted to touch on. Again, I want to kind of emphasize that our show network over here, these players are blasting out data to this controller. This controller is a constant stream of data coming and going, but nothing is going to the router, and nothing is going on inside your home either, because this is separate. These are 2 separate. They're separated by the switches. So your teenagers can use their phones, your wife can watch Netflix, and you can work on your sequencing computer, and it won't have any impact on what's going on outside. So it's important to keep these segregated like that. Flat network, what that means is the switches can be cascaded. So you can plug a switch into another switch, into another switch, into another switch if you need more ports. There's no physical limit, at least not that I'm aware of, but that starts introducing a little bit of lag because it's another bit of processing that has to go on as the data is going back and forth. So I would recommend not going more than 2 or 3 deep if you absolutely have to. If you need more ports, get a bigger switch. That's the better way to go. I have seen people use these as extenders, like in really long runs. They'll just add a switch and go down the road with it, and that works. But yeah, again, we want to try and keep the network as flat as possible. Also, one last thing, it may not be directly related, but I think it's important to point out these different RJ45 connectors here on the Christmas light controllers. I think a lot of the manufacturers have standardized on these, but these are what we call differential ports. The NICs for networks, they're made of metal and like a silver metal. Those are your network connections. These black ones are differential connections. What these do is they take 4 ports worth of data and consolidate it into one cable that you can run to a remote receiver and with its own power supply, and you can use those 4 ports elsewhere. Like the F16 here or the Genius 16, these are all great if you got a lot of lights in one spot, like a mega tree. But if you're spread out, you got props all over or doing a house outline, you may have a few receivers scattered around, and you can run these network cables. The distance on a network cable is about 300 feet, which gives you plenty of room to spread out. Whereas with a light extension, you're limited to roughly 40 or 50 feet at most. So this gives you a little more flexibility in your layouts. But the important thing here is they're both RJ45 connectors. They both use the same cables, but they're not the same data. So if you plug one of these into the wrong port, you can very easily damage your equipment. So be careful plugging things into those. And I think that is all I have. So at this point, I'll go ahead and open it up for questions. Hopefully that wasn't too much.
Does anyone have any questions for Shane? You type it in the question and answer section, we'll see it. Here we go. You're getting a lot of great jobs here, Shane.
Well, glad to hear it. Glad I covered everything. Thanks.
Okay, and George is asking, what did you say the distance is for network cable?
Okay. For the I believe the spec is about 300 feet or 100 meters. I know people have run them a lot further than that though, but I believe 300 feet is the spec.
Okay, and can you talk a little bit about wireless?
I knew that was coming.
Yeah.
So yeah, wireless. Personally, I don't use it, at least not in a show, and I don't trust it enough to be reliable enough to run a show. You can use it. I know there's some. I'm not too familiar with it as far as the show goes. One of the cool things though is with some of the culp controllers is let me pull that back up real quick. Some of the culp controllers that run the Beagle Bones, they have their own FPP instance. So you can have multiple FPP instances. These controllers, the Falcons and the Genius, they pull data directly from the show players. Whereas the culp controllers, they each have a copy of the show on board. And they each board, so you may have 3 or 4 different controllers in your show, and they use sync packets. Instead of sending data all throughout your network, they just send a little packet. They all start playing at the same time. And so that can definitely reduce a lot of traffic on your network. So if you're going to go wireless, I would definitely look into that because it's got a lot less overhead than something like this.
The next question is, why doesn't Christmas light wire carry data as far as a network cable?
So great question. That's mostly due to the construction of the Cat5e or Cat6 cables. The wires are twisted in a very specific pattern, and there's a lot of things that built up that helps it carry data. They're made to carry data long distances, like throughout a corporate building. Whereas the wires, the extension for a Christmas light, that carries 12 volts power along with a data signal. It's a different protocol, different type of data signal that doesn't travel as far. The Ethernet spec has a lot of error correction and efficiencies in it that help it travel long distances.
Okay, I'm going to skip one here. Why would the differential port hurt equipment? Not sure she understood that.
Okay, yeah. No, good question. That's because they're different protocols. They use the same connectors and the same cable, but there's different data going out. A typical Ethernet port, if I remember right, it only uses actually 2 of the 4 pairs, one to transmit, one to receive, one pair to transmit, one pair to receive. And it sends a very low level data signal. Whereas the differential ports, those use all 8 pairs. It sends data on on each of the 4 pairs, and it's I believe it's I want to say it's the serial data 485 or something like that. It's a completely different specification, different voltages, and if it's expecting one thing but getting another, it can damage the equipment.
Okay, there are a couple questions here asking about segregated show networks. And one says, is it better to have your show network on a separate subnet from your home when connected to the same network? And what is required for a segregated show network?
Okay. Yeah. So if you really want to do that, again, we're kind of starting to overcomplicate things here. I put this together because the switch isolates all this, even it's technically on the same network, but the data doesn't flow between the 2 networks, the two entities here. So if you want, you can put some people would put like a create a .2 network, 192.168.2, and have all the .2 stuff be their show network. But the problem with that is everything has to go through the router now. So now you're introducing a lot of data that's going back and forth to your router. So they're no longer separate. If you really wanted to do that, you could get a second router and set it up that way. But again, that's kind of beyond the scope of what I wanted to deliver on this class.
Can I use an old router as a switch, or would I need to buy a standalone switch?
You could. Yeah, so yeah, your router has a built-in switch here. These 4 ports are a switch technically. But again, as cheap as the switches are, I would just go with a legit switch. It'd be, again, they're plug and play. You don't have to set up or configure anything. And plus, if you add another router, this is going to have its own, it'd be a second DNS server, a second DHCP server, so that could cause some confusion as well. And they're both probably would have the same IP address too, so that could cause some traffic collisions on your network.
Okay, Aaron said, I had some troubles with us watching movies while my show was running last year. Would a switch solve that problem for the most part?
Yes, as long as it's set up like this. So all your show player, so if you have your X schedule plugged into your router or X player or whatever, it's going to go through the router and that's going to slow everything down. So make sure your show player and all your controllers are on one switch. And that should take care of all your issues inside while the show's playing.
Joel is asking, do you recommend power over the internet?
Power over the internet is great, but I don't think a lot of our controllers are compatible with it yet. And again, the PoE compatible switches are also pretty expensive.
Okay. See here, this is a long one. I use the Falcon F16 V4 with differential receivers for a 16-port differential receiver and an 8-port differential receiver. The first differential receiver will be the 16 and the final will be the 8-port. Do I need to run both differential receivers back to the F16, or can I daisy chain the Cat6 from differential receiver to differential receiver?
I think I follow what he's saying. So yeah, so the 16-port differential receiver would actually be the equivalent of 4 regular receivers, and the 8-port would be the equivalent of 2 regular receivers, which would be a total of 6 regular receivers, which I believe is the max for the smart receivers. So yes, you should be able to daisy chain those 2.
Okay. This is an easier question. What's the difference between a LAN port and a WAN port on your router?
Good question. So LAN stands for local area network. So that would be anything local, which is your switch. WAN stands for wide area network, which would include anything outside your local. So it's basically internet and local.
Next question. What is a differential cable spec?
I don't know if there's an actual spec for it, but as I mentioned, they use Cat5e and Cat6 cables, the same as your network.
Golly, I hope this person didn't do what they're asking in the next question. And that is, will crossing a Cat cable with a low voltage power cable like 12 volt cause trouble? I hear 120 volts is a no-no. I think blue smoke might be involved there.
If you're connecting them directly, yeah, that would be a bad idea. I think what he might be referring to though is wait, you got me I forget what they call it, but interference what they would call it. So yeah, sometimes in some cases bundling Cat5 cables next to a power cable can lead to interference. I don't think in our situation, I don't see it too much, but It can and does happen. Some ways to avoid that are, again, to keep the cables separate, or if you have to cross them perpendicularly as a cross instead of running them parallel to each other. Or you could upgrade to the shielded cable, and that should help eliminate a lot of the issues with that.
Ron is asking, tell us about your display and your network.
Um, sure. So I run my main controller is a Culp K40 running FPP. Keep it in my garage year round. As I got a few lights outside that I run holiday colors on. And then I got, I think, 3 other controllers. One I use for the yard, one for my matrix, one for my P5s, and I think I got one more. I'm not even sure off the top of my head, but yeah, I have a switch again just like this one in my garage. I have the K40, and I have some long runs to the other controllers that go out in the yard. This just a standard Cat 6A cable that I bought by mistake, or I regret buying, that run out to those controllers in the yard. And then a few differential cables coming off the K40. I wish I would have thought ahead. I'd post some pictures of it. But yeah, it's basically this. This is what I use. I keep a cable that goes directly to my router, which is up in my bedroom, that runs through the house, and all my stuff inside is on Wi-Fi or are directly connected.
Todd is asking, can you talk more about setting up a Pi to do a show?
That's kind of beyond the scope of this class. So what he's talking about is Falcon Player, or FPP, and there are a whole bunch of separate other classes that cover that topic.
Okay, and the last question I'm seeing right here is the slide deck available for a download? And that's your choice.
I'll offer it up if you want to post it somewhere.
Okay, I think we can do that.
Yeah,
Does
send it
anyone
to
else
me,
have
Shane, and I'll take care of that. Well, I have it already. I'll take care of it.
Okay, I think I updated it a little bit. I'll send you a new version.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I'm happy to share it.
Okay.
And Robert Biggs
So-
says, where's the recording posted? Joyce?
You will receive an email after, I think it takes them about 24 hours to get it finalized, and you'll receive an email where you can download the recording. It'll be right from Zoom.
Yeah, Dave Thomas points out that depending on the manufacturer of the hub, not the hub, the switch, it depends on what color it is.
Okay.
These are different than what Shane has.
Yeah, so they could vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, but there's usually a table or something printed on the front that'll tell you what the lights mean.
And George has asked, is there a specific brand of controller that you should use?
If you're talking Christmas light controllers, any of the big 3, the Culp, the Genius receivers, or the Falcons, those are all solid controllers. Excellent support in the community and involvement by the manufacturers. As far as network hardware, any of the cheap switches are fine. They all do the same thing. Again, they're very cheap. They're solid. If you want to spend a few extra bucks, get a nice one, go for it. But yeah, they're all pretty much the same.
Kyle is asking, can you show how to create a network on a laptop?
Not quite sure what he's after there, but I think I can show real quick maybe how to configure on Windows. Yeah, I'm still kind of getting used to Windows 10 here. Let's see. Okay, so here it kind of shows us our network status. Shows we're connected to the network here, and our network is connected to the internet. We can look at properties. Here we can see it's set to DHCP, so it automatically gets an address. I could change that to static here if I wanted to, but for a PC, I'm good with DHCP. Shows us our speed here. We're on a gigabit network. Showing us our IP address, and yeah, that's really all there is to it.
We've got 2 kudos from Karen Landris and Jeff Barsh talking about how wonderful this presentation was.
Oh, great. I'm happy to hear that. Thank you. Okay, so here's what all us old IT folks are kind of used to. This is the old Windows network setting. So it shows us our connection here. IPv6, that is around. Was supposed to take over for IP4 20 years ago, but no one ever uses it. But if we want to change things, we could click on the properties button here. Configure IPv4 properties. Yeah, and here's where we put in our new IP address, our subnet mask, which tells us what the network address is versus the host ID, and our default gateway. We can also put in our DNS servers here as well. But we don't need to change that here, so we won't.
There's a question on the initial slide that you had on networking. The question is, can you connect 2 PCs directly to each other without the use of a crossover cable or switch?
Yes, good question. So yeah, crossover cables were used a long time ago when Ethernet was first coming out. The Ethernet protocol is about 70 years old now, by the way, so it's been around a long time. But yeah, there's certain pins on the connectors that transmit and certain pins that receive. So a switch was designed to receive versus a PC that was designed to transmit, or vice versa. But if you connect a PC to a PC, you're going to hit the transmit pins to the transmit pins, and they're going to collide instead of talking to each other. However, a long time ago, they kind of redid the network interfaces. So now the pins automatically detect what's talking and what's receiving, and it configures itself accordingly. So almost any network device made in the past 10 to 15 years doesn't need a crossover cable anymore. So those are quickly becoming obsolete.
That is all the questions we have so far.
Awesome.
Okay, well, Kyle actually asked, he asked, can you create a VPN? Let me see here. I sent him a question back. Can you create a VPN to?
Yeah, I did see something about VPN.
There's controllers.
There's several ways to do that. Again, that's going to overcomplicate things a little bit more. That's a little bit more than I wanted to cover in this display or in this presentation.
That's all somebody says reports are out that the IPv6 will be the new norm in 5 years because IPv4 is running out of IPs.
I've been saying that for 20 years. Time will tell. We'll see.
That's all of our questions.
All right. Well, thanks,
thank you,
everyone.
everyone. Shane, excellent presentation. We really appreciate your time and your expertise, sharing it with the Christmas Expo community. Everyone have a good evening and good luck with your shows.
Thank you.
Bye now.